Welcome everybody to our July Lunch and Learn. Today we're going to be talking about landscaping to minimize fire damage. Our illustrious retired county agent is here today to tell us all about it, Richard Parrish. Next month we have container gardening with Karen C. Don't forget, second Wednesday of the month. With that, I'll let you go.
All righty. Thank you, Teresa. Well, it's good to be with y'all here this morning, I guess this afternoon now, as we talk about landscaping to minimize fire damage. You know, here we are in Leon County, and sometimes we think about this topic, especially if we think back for the last few summers, maybe not right now, but if we think back to the last 2 or 3, 4, 5 summers, as hot as it has been, as dry as it has been, we're thinking, dadgum, you know, I hope that my pasture, my lawn, my trees, hope they don't catch on fire. But this is something that could very well happen. I mean, if we think back a few years, think back to 2011, the people of Bastrop were really affected by wildfires. I mean, not only did that change the fabric of that community, I mean, it changed the landscape of Bastrop and those lost pines. You know, and even as we watch the news, we hear about wildfires in California, and there's wildfires in California going on right now. We think here even recently, we think back to Ruidoso, New Mexico, how they evacuated the whole town, and there were 1,400 structures or so that were lost due to fire. You know, every year it seems like we're hearing about wildfires up in the panhandle of Texas. So wildfires are something that is definitely something that needs to be in our mind, maybe not in the forefront, but we need to be thinking about wildfires and what we can do to help protect the investment that we have in our own property around our houses. And we can help to do some of that by making a few choices within our landscape to help minimize fire damage. Now, you know, there's no such thing as a fireproof landscape unless it's completely covered in concrete. And and you've got flowers that are from like the statuaries or the foundries where, you know, everything's made of concrete. That's about the only way you're going to have a fireproof landscape. So while there's no way you can have a true fireproof landscape, there are some landscape decisions that you can make to help prevent or minimize. I guess rather than the word prevent, I should have used the word minimize the spread of fire and damage. Now, also, as we go through the presentation, you know, I'm going to be talking about some landscaping designs and ideas or plants to minimize fire damage or maybe some things to avoid. And you're going to be thinking, well, dadgum, I've got that around my house right now. I'm not saying that you have to remove everything around your house. So if you do have existing plants in your landscape that are especially prone to fire, I'm not telling you that you must remove them from your landscape. But, you know, you might have to make a little routine maintenance on some of those plants. If it's a certain type of tree, maybe pruning the tree, maybe raking up some of the debris or litter that is underneath the tree to minimize fire damage, maybe to trim out some of those dead branches. And I know with some of the recent windstorms we've had over the last few months, Mother Nature has helped to do that for us. That's what I spent yesterday doing, was raking up some of the dead branches and stuff. So, and if you look at my house, my landscape right now, you're going to see that what I'm talking about today, I've got trees close to my house. You know, I'm not practicing FIREWISE landscaping 100%, but I am doing some maintenance on those trees to minimize that damage. So I'm not saying you have to redo everything, but, you know, just look at your landscape, look at what you're wanting to do, take those steps in order to minimize that damage to fire. So basically, this is what we're going to cover over the next hour. We're going to understand wildfire, talk a little bit about how homes ignite, talk about a hazard assessment, and then some landscaping, some steps that you can do, some plants that you can use to minimize fire damage. And the words of Smokey the Bear, only you can prevent wildfires. I know it used to be forest fires. I remember growing up, only you can prevent forest fires, but you know, fires happen in more than just the forest. And as we look around Leon County, do we live in the forest? Well, depending on what part of Leon County, you may live in the forest, but we've also got quite a bit of open rangeland as well. So only you can prevent wildfires, regardless of where they are. Only you can prevent those wildfires. So let's understand a little bit about wildfire. fire is an essential process. Before we moved here, fires were coming through here every 5 to 10 years or so, burning off the dead vegetation and renewing the earth. So fire is a natural process. We move in and we try to screw things up. We try to mess with Mother Nature. And y'all might remember those old commercials. It's not nice to fool Mother Nature. Because what does Mother Nature do? Then there'd always be that clap of thunder. It's not nice to fool Mother Nature. Well, we can't fool Mother Nature. Fire is a natural process. Now we can try being the little gods that we are. We're gonna do what we can to save our little property. We're gonna do what we can to manage fire. But fire is natural. That fire removes dead and dying vegetation. It helps to replenish nutrients into the soil as that old vegetative matter burns. It releases that nutrient back into the soil, and it creates a healthy ecosystem. So fire in and of itself is not a bad thing. Fire when it's running across your property headed to your house, that's a bad thing. So, fire in and of itself is not bad. So, as we have built our communities, we've kind of altered those historic fire cycles. And as a result, it has led to an increase, a buildup of vegetative matter, whether it be through grass, through leaves, through tree debris. We've done that. We've done that. So with this buildup of vegetative matter, we're seeing more fires. We're seeing more wildfires. We're seeing more larger fires. And also with the absence of fire, we're actually seeing some effects on some of our plant and animal life communities as well. So, fire is a good thing if managed properly. So when we talk about fire and how fire can ignite a home, we're going to 3 ways in which fire can ignite homes. One is through fuels, and we've already talked a little bit about that, and I'm not talking gasoline. We're talking fuels such as dead grass, leaves, dead trees, dead branches on the ground, weather, and the terrain. Terrain also plays a factor in how fire moves. So with those fuels, dead grass, leaves, dead trees, branches, that's all fuel, stuff that can ignite and burn. And I know, I'm going to back up a little bit. I know I said earlier that before we got here, fire was a natural process coming through and burning every 5 to 10 years or so. How did that fire start? Nobody was there lighting a match, but how did it start? Primarily through lightning. Lightning strikes and burn, and it would set the landscape on fire. Every now and then you might have a Native American or an Indian have a campfire get out of control or something, but primarily those fires were generated through lightning strikes, burning off that fuel. Well, surface fuels, that's the fuel that's going to be on the ground, at ground level. That's where our grasses are. That's where our fallen leaves are. I'm not saying that you need to rake up your leaves. If you do rake up your leaves, put them in your compost bin. Otherwise, you're removing a valuable source of nutrition from your soil. If you're going to leave your leaves, maybe mulch them up real small. By mulching them up real small, they're going to decompose faster, and you are helping to eliminate or remove a possible fuel source. And then, of course, whenever our trees lose branches, whenever those trees die, that makes great wildlife habitat by creating snag and other places for critters to live, but it's a fuel source as well. So depending on where those dead trees and branches are on your property, make an assessment. Should I remove them or should I leave them for wildlife? Realizing that, of course, that is a potential fuel. So that's our surface fuels, and then our ladder fuels. We've got some big trees here in Leon County, tall trees. As these fires start and they burn fuel at the surface, those flames can rise, catching our taller trees on fire. So ladder fuels are those tall trees that burn from the ground up. And so we can spread fire by that fire moving up or burning up those trees, kind of like climbing a ladder. So that's how, yes?
The 2011 fire was not a ladder fuel. Mm-hmm. It was treetop jumping.
So well, and that kind of gets to what we call crown fuels. So she was saying that the 2011 fire in Concord was not through surface or ladder fuels, but it was jumping from tree to tree. And that's what's referred to as crown fuel. So whenever it gets to the top of those trees, you know, wind's blowing, you've got embers that are blowing as well. Those embers can travel a great distance. So jumping from tree to structure, that's those crown fuels that are burning. So fire can ignite a home through several different mechanisms through fuel. But then, of course, you know, when I alluded to this a little bit earlier in regards to weather, the last several years, and so far we've been very fortunate that I should have found the most recent drought monitor, but we're not in a drought right now. But the last several summers, we have been in some extreme drought conditions. So in those extreme drought conditions, we've had dry weather with low humidity, ideal fire conditions. Whenever in 2011, whenever those fires were burning in Bastrop, the humidity was especially low. It was below 20%. I can't remember the exact humidity level, but I know there, whenever I was in San Marcos at the time, and we had some fires going in Dripping Springs, nothing near as large as the 34,000 acres that was burning in Bastrop. But on that day, it was warm, and the humidity was below 20%. So we had those are ideal fire conditions. Fortunately, whenever I was there in San Marcos fighting those fires in Dripping Springs, that same weekend that they were fighting fires in Bastrop, we didn't have the wind. But with those dry, low humidity conditions and the wind blowing, that's just going to push that fire to those fuel sources, just push it going. So we see that, you know, dry, low humid conditions during drought conditions. During these drought conditions, our plants are starving for moisture. They die, they go dormant. In many cases, in some cases, they might even die. Wind blows, so drought conditions, we really need to be cognizant of fire and take steps ahead of a drought condition in order to plan for fire. If we do our homework ahead of time, we don't have to really scramble and hurry and struggle during those drought conditions because we've taken some steps ahead of time. I guess preventative maintenance would be a term you could certainly use, that you can get through a drought. I'm not going to say you're going to prevent fire or prevent the risk of fire, but you can certainly minimize it. And then, of course, terrain has something to do with fire movement as well. Now, here in Leon County, for the most part, we're fairly flat, although we do have some hills. Well, if we think about heat rises. Well, fire, is fire hot or cold? It's hot. So fire will run or move quickly uphill because that heat rises. As fire burns, that heat is rising and it's drying vegetation uphill. Well, as that vegetation gets dry, that fire is going to continue moving quickly uphill because it has dry fuel or dry vegetation. So fire can move quickly uphill. So while terrain might not play as big a factor here in Leon County, if we were in areas that had a lot of hills and you lived at the top of the hill, that would be that might be a little bit of concern, wondering, okay, what type of vegetation is down below me on that hill? So that's, fuels, weather, and terrain. That's how homes ignite, how fires can move. Now, as we look at our properties, as we walk around our property, seeing what type of vegetation we have, do we have a lot of dead grass or trees? Are we on top of a hill? We might do a hazard assessment around our property. And that hazard assessment would be, where am I? What is my risk if a wildfire was to come? So if you're in a low hazard area, you've got limited wildland and vegetation is not continuous. And what do I mean by not continuous? You've got maybe a driveway through there. You've got some sidewalks. You've got some paths that don't have any kind of vegetation. So you've got some breaks within your vegetative areas. That would be where it's not continuous. And in a humid climate with a short dry season. Well, that's not necessarily us. We have our fair share of humidity, and when we do have a dry season, it's usually a long dry season. Normally it's like May through September. So we've got a long dry season, but we're humid. So for the most part, we are not in a low hazard area. So as we continue to examine our properties, we're either going to be in a mild or moderate or a high hazard area. So those moderate hazard fire areas are those wildlands that are continuous within and around a community, with a lot of flammable vegetation, broadleaf, and evergreen. So there's no roads, there's no sidewalks, there's no driveways, or not many at least. And we're going to talk more about evergreens here in a little bit. What type of evergreens do we have here in Leon County to be concerned about? Pines, primarily pines. I mean, when we think back to Bastrop in 2011, they had an ideal fuel source with those pines. We've got our fair share of pines here. And then when we look at those high hazard areas, dense vegetation, highly flammable vegetation, medium to tall broadleaf evergreens and conifers, and then multiple occurrences of dry, windy conditions, prolonged drought, or dry season that lasts for 3 or more months. So for this year, I'm going to say right now, we are probably here in Leon County in this moderate hazard area. For the past few summers, we've been in this high hazard area. But this year, as of right now, and who knows what the weather's going to do from here on out for the rest of the summer, but right now, I'm going to say that we're probably in this moderate hazard area. Well, let's kind of shift gears a little bit and look at your own, each individual property. So when we're thinking about fire on your property, what I need to do to minimize wildfire risk at my place, you can divide where your house is, divided into zones. Zone 1, Zone 2, and Zone 3. And that Zone 3 would probably be, this whole Zone 1 to 3 is probably 100 to 200 foot from your house. Now, I realize that some of you live on maybe smaller acreage, and your whole property might be 200 foot wide. So if that's the case, you've got your zone, but for those of y'all that live on larger properties, larger acreage, look at that 200-foot radius out from your house and divide that into zones, Zone 1, Zone 2, Zone 3. And we're going to talk a little bit more about these zones here momentarily. Think about this with your house, though. We're thinking about our house. Some of us, we might have a deck, or we might have a shed or some sort of building that is attached to our house. If it's attached to the house, it's part of the house. So think of it that way. Even if you have a deck or a porch, that is part of your house as well. So as you're identifying your zones, make sure that you include those fences that might be attached to the house, those porches. Make sure you include that as you measure those zones. And let's think about maybe some of the things that our houses are made of, and maybe some construction materials that we can use to minimize fire damage as well. Probably first and foremost is our roofs. We've got embers that are flying from a fire landing on our roof. The composition or what our roofs are made of can certainly help to minimize that fire risk. So composition shingles, a metal roof, a clay, or those tiled terracotta type roofs, those aren't going to burn, or at least they're not going to burn easily. So from a roofing standpoint, that would probably be some of the better materials to use to help minimize fire damage with our roofs. We might even look at what the composition of the exterior of our house is made of. Is it stucco? Is it stone? Is it brick? Is it cinder block, hardy plank? What is it made of? Or is it wood? Is it a log cabin? Is it a wood house? If it were a wood house, I might be concerned. I do know that they make paints that are supposed to be fire resistant or more fire retardant. It takes a higher temperature and a longer exposure to set that on fire. If you've got a wood house, you might look at maybe investing in some of those paints that are more fire resistant. Vinyl siding melts really easily when it gets really hot. Nothing sadder than seeing just melted vinyl. It just looks like big frowns everywhere because you've got this big pile of melted goo that used to be vinyl. Maybe putting some sort of metal screening behind the vinyl, between the vinyl and your house, just to protect the house. So you might lose the vinyl, but that metal screening helps to protect the structure. What kind of windows do you have? Double pane windows or tempered glass are ideal. You're going to pay a little bit more for them, but they can stand the heat. a lot better than those single pane windows do. Look around the eaves of your house. Look at the fascias. Look at the soffits. What do they look like? What type of air ventilation holes are there? Ideally, you want about 1/8 of an inch or smaller. Now, I'm not saying that if you go home because your house was built 30 years ago and you've got larger than 1/8 inch, no, I'm not saying go and replace everything. But the reason you want 1/8 inch or smaller holes in those eaves and fascias and soffits, if embers were to fly and get caught up in there, 1/8 of an inch is pretty small. It's harder for them 1/8 of an inch embers to get up into your attic and cause some fires. So I'm not saying if it's larger than 1/8 inch, you need to go rebuild your whole house, move, whatever. No, I'm not saying that. But ideally, you want those holes to be 1/8 of an inch or smaller. And then also, look at your roof. Look at your gutters. How many of y'all compost in your gutters? Thank you for your honesty. My hand is up also. But when you're composting in your gutters, what's in there? You've got fuel, you've got leaves, you've got branches, you've got Lord knows what else. Most of the stuff that's in there is flammable. So clean your gutters out on a regular basis. Now, hopefully, everybody fared pretty well this past Monday with Hurricane Beryl. As I was listening to the police scanner, listening to what was happening in Leon County, a large number of the calls that our local volunteer fire departments were called out on dealt with trees and power lines. What was happening was, because of the winds, trees were falling on power lines and they were sparking, they were catching on fire. So that was a large part of the calls that our firefighters were dealing with on Monday. So that's one of the things we can do to help minimize our fire damage, is to look at where our trees are in relation to power lines. Well, on average power line's about 20 to 25 foot tall. So if we're going to be planting trees around power lines, let's think about how big could this tree potentially get. I mean, whenever we plant a tree, we might have a nice 6-foot tree, but that tree's going to grow, we hope. How big is it going to get? And if you've got a tree that's going to get 20 foot tall or greater, I would make sure it's planted far away from power lines. Now, I know many of us have been here for years, or we've bought a house, and whenever we bought the house, there were trees, big trees by the power line. I'm in the same situation. I don't know if I want to cut them down, but I will say over the past few years, as the winds that we've had and some branches have broken out, I have actually cut down some trees by power lines, because I realize those trees could potentially fall on the power line, and I'm not going to have the electricity that I need to keep me warm in the winter or cool in the summer. So it's an investment, so to say, to either make sure you're planting trees that's not going to get taller than those power lines, or to move back some of those tall trees, move back by cutting them and replanting somewhere else. So ideally, 20-foot tall trees should be, if you're going to plant near power lines, that's what you're looking for. How far should you plant back from power lines, though? At least small trees, those trees that are 20 foot tall or shorter, you can plant within 5 foot of a power line. I would err on the side of caution and move back even further. Also, you can plant those trees, because you got to remember, not only do these trees grow up, but they grow out also. These small trees, 20 foot or less, you can plant them within 8 feet of a power pole. Here again, I'm going to err on the side of caution. I'm going to probably plant further away. I'm probably going to go 10 to 15 foot out if I'm going to be planting a new tree in the area of a power line. I'm not going to plant a tree that gets over 20 foot tall anywhere close to a power line, knowing that even if I plant it 20 foot away, it's going to get 30 foot tall. If it falls, it could potentially fall on that power line. I'm just going to err on the side of caution, but this is what the Texas Forest Service recommends. If you're going to plant a tree near a power line, if short trees, at least 5 foot away from the power line, 8 foot away from the pole. Now, so that's power lines. Let's talk about the actual landscaping around your house though. So I talked about these zones earlier, these ignition zones. And that's the zones where basically about 200 foot out from your house. So zone one, that's going to be the area that's closest to your house. It's about, consider that about 30 foot from your house in any part that is attached to your house, 30 foot out. That would be considered zone one. So this is the area where you really want to have a lot of control over, because as that fire is getting close to your house, this is where you want short stuff. Even though, if from fires in zone 2 or 3, those embers can still move, and they could cause the fire or the plants in that zone 1 to catch fire. The lower, shorter the plants you have around zone 1, the better off you're going to be. So in that zone 1, in that area 30 foot from your house, keep it irrigated, keep it well watered, and keep it free of dry vegetation. So if you've got tall grass, mow it. If you've got, I realize in the wintertime, a lot of our plants go dormant. And they look nice. They kind of give that native appearance. But that's fuel. So you might want to consider mowing that back. So keep it mowed, keep it well irrigated. Within 5 foot of your house, we can kind of look on the floor and get an idea of what 5 foot is. I think this table that the computer is sitting on, that's 6 foot. So that kind of gives you an idea. But within 5 foot of the house, it's recommended to use non-flammable landscaping materials, rocks, pavers. Now I know many of us have mulch around our flower beds and around our house. I'm guilty of that as well. If you're going to use mulch around your house, I would recommend using a hardwood mulch, such as some sort of oak or maple, some sort of hardwood mulch, as opposed to a pine bark mulch. We're going to talk more about why pine, what the problem with pine is here in a little bit. But pine, the resins and the oil in pine are very flammable. So pine bark mulch can do a great job as a mulch. It can look really pretty, but if it gets dried out and catches a fire, you're going to have a heck of a fire on your hands as well. Also, some other possibilities as a mulch around your house. You might look at maybe decomposed granite or even maybe some gravel around some of the flower beds. And I know I'm going to pick on David a little bit, because I know David just recently, within the last year, changed out the mulch and the landscaping around his house. I'm not going to say that he did it for fire control. He did it just because he's getting old and lazy, and he didn't want to have to weed around his house. But that was actually smart thinking on his part, because now by removing some of that bark mulch, he's actually created a barrier to help keep fire away from his house. Also in that zone 1, if you've got firewood, for those of y'all that cut and stack firewood, keep it at least 30 foot away from your house. Keep it out of zone 1, put it in zone 2. I realize that in the winter it gets cold. You have to trug out there in the cold to get that wood and bring it all the way back, but you're having that fuel source away from your house. I've already mentioned this, but in that zone 1, remove dead vegetation. Keep patio cushions inside the house when you're not using them during periods of high fire potential. What are these patio cushions made out of? They're made of some sort of synthetic plastic polymer stuff that is highly flammable. So in periods of high fire potential, bring them in. Especially if you know there's a high fire danger and you see smoke in the distance, bring them in. Because the last thing you want is an ember lighting on that patio cushion and starting a fire. We've already talked about this. Removing that composting system from your gutters. Remove those leaves from your gutters. We don't think about this, but wood fences. What are wood fences typically made of? What type of wood is that typically made out of? Cedar. Well, cedar is very similar to a pine in that it contains a lot of oils and resins, makes excellent fire starters kindling. So, what type of fence do you have? You might want to think about I mean, that dadgummit, that cedar fence sure looks nice, but you might want to think about maybe moving to a metal or type fence. And then, of course, if you've got a wooden deck or a patio or a porch, you've got a source of fuel there as well. I'm not saying to tear it down, but if you've got a fire coming, you might want to wet it down real good with water. Or if you do want to change out, maybe think about doing something with cinder blocks and concrete. So in that zone 1, that 30-foot area closest to your house, these are some trees to avoid. Avoid cedar. Avoid cypress. Avoid pine. You notice something that these 3 have in common? They're all evergreens for one thing. They're all types of conifers. Avoid those within that 30-foot zone closest to your house. And we'll talk more about why to avoid those here in a little bit. Some small trees within that zone 1, avoid any kind of small palms. Because of the nature of their leaf, they can be a great conduit for fire as well, and we'll talk more about that here soon as well. Avoid those plants that have a high oil content. Yaupon, how many of us have yaupon around our house? Now, okay, how many of you have yaupon around your house by choice? Probably none of us have it around our house by choice. But golly, geez, those things get caught on fire. They burn easy. You could pull one out of the ground, put it on a fire, and it's going to immediately pop and spark. And these things are highly flammable because of the oils that are in them. So avoid those yaupons near your house. Other shrubs to avoid: bottlebrush, elaeagnus, flamacanthus, oleander. Rosemary. Oh, golly geez, rosemary. Whoo! Y'all ever lit a rosemary bush on fire? A 3-foot rosemary, and you're going to have 9-foot flames because of the oils that are in rosemary. It's a great herb, but don't plant it by your house. Plant it out somewhere, not by your house. But then if we look at some of our other herbs, oregano and sage, they've got some great flavor and oils in them as well, but they're highly flammable. And then when we look at fountain grass and our muley type grasses, beautiful landscape grasses, but a lot of times we'll let them go dormant because, or even die because they just look good. But guess what? We've got an ideal fuel source right there. So these are great to have in your landscape, just not within 30 feet of your house. Some other things to avoid: jasmine, coral vine, wisteria, even trailing rosemary as a ground cover. Avoid those. I would not have those in that 30-foot zone 1 area of your house. As we move out a little bit further, we look at zone 2. Zone 2 is that area 30 foot to 100 foot from your house. Ideally, what the Forest Service says, Texas Forest Service says, is plants should be low growing, well irrigated, less flammable. If you've got clusters of trees, leave about 30 foot in between those clusters of trees and use fuel breaks such as driveways or gravel walkways to break up that area in zone 2. And then this is where some of that maintenance comes in. Prune trees so that branches and leaves are 6 to 10 foot above the ground. If you've got a fire going on the ground because of surface fuels, sometimes that fire can reach up 6 to 10 feet, but it's going to be a little bit harder. Those leaves are going to dry 6 to 10 feet, but it's going to be harder for those leaves to catch fire and that tree to catch fire if it's up. So prune those trees back 6 to 10 feet up above the ground in that zone 2. And then we move to zone 3, which is 100 to 200 foot out from your house. Remove heavy accumulation of woody debris. This might be dead trees. This might be dead branches that are fallen on the ground. Remove small conifers between trees. If we were to walk out in pasture, your pasture, my pasture right now, I know in mine, I see small pine trees growing. I see small cedar trees growing. Wow, they can burn quick and big. So I'm going to remove them. And I'm also going to maybe thin out the canopy of some of those taller trees to make sure that the trees aren't touching. Because if the trees are touching, that just leaves an excellent little road or a path for fire to follow from tree to tree to tree to tree. If I'm going to have a wildfire come through my property, I'm going to make that fire work to get to where it's going to be. I want to do what I can to to minimize it. So I'm going to clean out some of those canopies of the trees. Now, we've already talked about these. We said we don't want to plant these in zone 1. Well, I don't know. I might even think about avoiding them in all zones. Now, I know that cedars can make a nice tree. Pines can make a nice tree. You know, I've got pines, and I've planted pines on my property. So, you know, what you got to think about, okay, if I'm going to plant pines, I'm going to have to do the maintenance in order to clean them up, to raise that canopy, to maybe even rake up the fallen needles underneath, because that's excellent fuel. So I would say, you know, the plants we talked about avoiding in zone 1, you might even want to consider avoiding those in all zones. Now, yaupon, yeah. Yeah, we can avoid yaupon, right? We've got Mother Nature and her birds to thank for our spread of yaupon. No, it's not. We have to learn to live with it.
60-foot American hollies?
Those, you know, those hollies, those leaves, the 60-foot American hollies, beautiful tree. They're in the same family as a yaupon. They can be very flammable as well. I would plant them in zone 3. I've got a 40-foot American holly in my back part of my property. Beautiful tree, but it's far enough. It's in the zone 3 area of my property.
Sweet gum work.
Oh, a sweet gum. Actually, they're better than you think. I'm not a fan of sweet gums, but I will say when it comes to fire control, to minimize the threat of fire damage, sweet gums, that's maybe one of their few saving graces, but we'll talk more about that here in a little bit. So the thing to remember, no plant is fireproof. If the fire is hot enough, intense enough, it's going to burn. So no plant is fireproof. But some characteristics you want to look for in plants to include in your landscape. The tissues are going to contain more moisture, especially during the fire season. Well, you mentioned sweet gum. In our droughts, how many sweet gums have we seen die? I can't kill those son of a guns. So yeah, so sweet gum that's one of their saving grace. You know, oaks, those deciduous trees, actually, they contain a whole lot more moisture, and so those are some good ones to plant. Tissues contain low amounts of volatile oils and other flammable materials or flammable chemicals. Pine trees, cypress trees, cedar trees, they all contain those volatile oils. So if you're going to have them, put them in zone 3. Plants that provide less fuel, either by producing less litter or by staying smaller. When I say plant litter, I'm talking about maybe leaves falling on the ground. If you do have a tree or a plant that has a lot of leaf loss, rake that stuff up and either mulch it or put it in your compost bin. Do something with it rather than letting it stay on the ground. And plants that are compact or low to the ground, those low-growing plants do some of the best job in minimizing the spread of fire. They're small, they burn quickly, they're done. So that's a plant characteristic to look for. And I know that I've talked about pines and cedars and cypress, you know, avoiding them, but the thing that we also need to remember is that all trees, regardless of what type of tree, provides some amount of fuel for fire. So make sure that you maintain them by raising the canopy level, maybe raking up some of those leaves, mulching those leaves. So those broadleaf trees, our oaks, our elms, our sweet gums, those deciduous trees that we've got are less flammable than our conifers. And like I said, you want plants that are low to the ground, green and healthy, low maintenance, and those that require minimal water. So we might think about some of our natives, and I'm going to talk more about natives here shortly, but also we might think a little bit about xeriscaping. Now, I say xeriscaping, and people have an image of a lawn in like Tucson, Arizona, where it's like rock. No. I mean, in Tucson, yes, for them that's xeriscaping, but we could practice some xeriscaping here by planting plants in our landscape that require less water, can survive the heats of our summer, and provide a beautiful landscape. So we might even think about some of the xeriscaping type plants. Regardless of if it's a tree or a shrub or a ground cover or a grass, regular maintenance is important to remove that dead vegetative material, keeping those crowns clean and high. And if you see some plants that's dead, whether it be a tree or a shrub, get rid of them. And also, make sure that the plants that we consider are cold hardy, because I know these last few winters we've had, they've been some doozies. And well, we thought it was cold hardy, but golly geez, when you get to -1 for several days in a row, well, it's just not going to make it, especially right now because of how crazy our weather has been with cold and hot and cold and hot and floods and dry famines. Our plants are stressed. So while we're planting plants that are designed for our zone, they're stressed, and as a result, some are living, some are dying. They're in need of help. But make sure you plant those plants that are cold hardy, because in the wintertime, it's gonna, if we have a fire come through in the wintertime, those cold hardy plants, they're gonna help do their part to control fire, but then they're gonna survive on into the spring as well. Now, here's a good word, a new word. Here's like the 50-cent word of the day: pyrophytic plants, or pyrophytic plants. These are basically, and we're thinking about wildfire, these are plants to avoid. Pyrophytic plants are plants that ignite readily and burn intensely. So these are some characteristics of these pyrophytic, or these fire plants. They usually have a blade leaf like our palms, or a needle leaf like our pines. They have stiff, woody, small or fine, lacy leaves. Their leaves and wood usually contain volatile waxes or fats or terpenes or oils. If you crush the leaves and it provides a strong odor, that's probably going to be a pyrophytic plant. Their sap is usually gummy. If we damage a pine tree, or we see a damage on a pine tree from a pine beetle, that sap is gummy. You break open, or you break back a leaf on a cedar tree, that sap is gummy. That gummy sap is highly flammable. So avoid those trees, those plants that have that gummy sap, has a strong odor. They'll usually contain plentiful fine, twiggy, dry, or dead material. You look under a pine tree, and what do you see? A lot of plentiful, fine, twiggy, dry, or dead material. And in some cases, they may even have a loose or a papery bark. So all of these are characteristics of those plants that ignite and burn very easily. So if you decide to have those pyrophytic plants in your landscape, keep them pruned, keep the canopies thinned, remove dead materials regularly, and keep them at least 15 foot from any structure or other plants. I would say 30 to 40 foot, because these things, they can really burn quickly, burn intensely. So, we've seen this again. These are some of those pyrophytic plants. Now, I use the term fire-resistant plants rather loosely, because as we've already mentioned, no plant is 100% fire-resistant. But those plants that are more resistant, or not as likely to catch fire and catch fire as intensely as those pines, those cypresses, those yaupons, these are your broadleaf deciduous trees. These are your trees that lose their leaves. Their leaves tend to be supple, moist, easily crushed. The trees tend to be clean, not bushy. They have a little dead wood. Shrubs are low growing, maybe about 2 foot tall, with minimal dead material. Tall shrubs are clean, not so bushy. And the sap is water-like. It's not gummy like those conifers, but it's more water-like, and the sap typically does not have a strong odor to it. So these are characteristics to look for in some of those more fire-resistant type plants. Now, I mentioned native plants earlier. Native plants are certainly something to consider. Native plants may survive our environmental conditions better than some of our other adapted plants, or plants that we bring in from somewhere else because we think they're pretty. These native plants are rarely weedy. They do well with little or no additional water. But the thing to remember is, just because a plant is native to Texas doesn't necessarily mean it's native to Leon County. There are plants that are native to West Texas that are they may grow here, but they're not going to do as well here, even though they're a Texas native, because they're not adapted to our soil and our climate conditions. So do keep that in mind if you decide to go native. And some native plants that are intense burners: cypress is native, juniper is native, pine is native. So don't think, oh, I'm going native, I'm minimizing my risk of fire damage. No, we've still got some natives that will provide some intense fires. So let's talk about some plants to put in your landscape, or to consider putting in your landscape, to help minimize that fire damage. So grasses, let's start at the ground and work our way up. Grasses, low-growing grasses are useful anywhere. We've got native grasses, we've got buffalo grass, we've got side oats, grama, we've got our introduced grasses such as Bermuda grass and St. Augustine and zoysia grass. Some of those, they all have different challenges and they all have different requirements. But, keeping it well watered, keeping it mowed to the proper height, not necessarily scalping it, but keeping it mowed and healthy at the proper height. Your grass will help to minimize fire moving into that zone 1 especially. Now, we've talked about grasses. I've talked a lot about turf grasses. I would avoid planting any kind of ornamental grass such as a fountain grass or a muley grass, those grasses that get really tall. I would avoid those in zone 1. I would even think twice about having some of those bigger bunch grasses like blue stem. I would avoid even having some native blue stems in that zone 1. They look nice. They provide great habitat for ground nesting birds. In the wintertime, they got that nice brown color to them. They look nice, but they're flammable as well. So I would maybe even keep some of those out of that zone 1. If we think about ground covers, think about low growing. Succulents. Succulents are probably the best plant to help minimize fire damage, because what's it full of? It's full of water. It's going to have to get pretty hot in order to boil that water or cause that plant material to burst but because of that heated water. But so succulents are great. Now, how many of us have succulents in our landscape? Very few of us. I've got succulents in a pot, but here in this area, succulents just don't do well as a landscape plant. The best ground cover is a spreading plant which forms a dense mat of roots and foliage that reduces soil erosion while excluding weeds. So if we can have that dense mat of roots, it's going to help keep moisture in our soil. We're going to have a healthy plant. Make sure we've got adequate irrigation. So some things to now, this is by no means is this an exhaustive list, but Lairope, purple heart, Greg's dahlia. There's a whole long list of plants that are good examples of ground cover for this area. When we think about maybe including some of our herbaceous perennials, perennials are nice. They add color to our landscape, adds a little bit of variety. Tall perennials can present some fire damage if they're allowed to dry out. So if you've got a taller perennial and it kind of dies back or dries out, go ahead and trim that back just to reduce that fuel load. Plant your perennials on a wide space beds separated by fire breaks. So have you some sidewalks or some paths put in the middle. And do not plant these herbaceous perennials next to structures, houses, sheds, barns, outbuildings, unless they're small in stature, maybe 2 foot, maybe 3 foot or less. Frequently water them. Make sure that you weed the beds on a regular basis, and make sure the tops are removed after they dry out. So what are some examples of some herbaceous perennials that make great landscaping plants in regards to minimizing fire? The cast iron plant, or the aspidistria, Turk's cap, guara, indigo spires, irises, pride of Barbados, lantana, rock rose, salvias, the black-eyed Susans. All of these are good herbaceous perennials that have a low to low moderate fire ignition point. Moving on to shrubs. Here again, just like our herbaceous perennials, they add color, they add structure to a landscape. Our shrubs, because they are a little bit bigger, they can be a significant source of fuel. And they can function as a fire ladder if planted underneath a tree. So, or underneath those tree crowns. So if you've got some of those shrubs, maybe plant them away from your trees, just so it doesn't provide a stepping stool or a ladder to get to those trees. Mow grass. Keep the area around those shrubs maintained. Trim away any dead leaves and branches annually. If it's a type of shrub that drops a lot of leaves, make sure you clean out those leaves and debris from underneath the plant, just to minimize the fuel load. So some great shrubs that we might think about is the American beautyberry, the dwarf crepe myrtle. It's those crepe myrtles that are 6 foot and lower. Those that 6 foot and over 6 foot make a beautiful tree, but here again, you've got some tall possible ladder plants around your house. Esperanza, roses. Here again, just a short list of some shrubs that will do well in helping to minimize that fire damage. And then trees, and I know a lot of times over the last 50 minutes or so, I've made reference to trees just because we've got so many trees in our landscape, and we think about forest fires or those trees catching and spreading. But you know, trees are a great addition to the landscape. They help enhance the property, and they also add to the value of our property. Just make sure that with our trees, if you're going to plant a tree in that zone 1 nearest your home, make sure it's a small tree. I would say probably under 10 foot. As you get out to zone 2 or 3, then you can plant the bigger trees. Near the home, trees should be planted such that they're crowned. So, you know, we think about, oh, how tall this tree is going to get. We don't always think about how wide that tree is going to get. So with those smaller trees, plant a small tree whose crown is not going to get more than 10, 15 foot. If you plant a tree less than 10 foot tall, it's typically not going to get to be that 10 or 15 foot crown. Make sure you allow plenty of room between the trees for them to grow. As we drive down the road, we see what Mother Nature has done. She's planted trees real close together, and in some cases it's stunted those trees. It's caused some of those trees to die back or die out because they can't get the sunlight they need. They don't have the room they need to grow. They don't get the water that they need because of competition with the other plants. So make sure you allow plenty of room for those trees to grow. Keep at least 10 foot between those mature crowns. Prune the limbs 6 to 10 foot tall above the ground. Do not allow shrubs to grow underneath those trees, and we've already talked about that as well. Deciduous trees, that's those trees that lose their leaves. They have that higher moisture content. They're less flammable. They provide less fuel during the dormant period. Here again, though, mulch or rake up and compost their leaves. I know those leaves provide great nutrients, so I always mulch my leaves. But here again, you know, it's a fuel source. But you know, conifers, those pines, those cypress, those junipers, they have the most flammable resins that those dry needles can drop and accumulate. Great place for a fire to start. So under your pines, I might go ahead and rake that stuff up and either put it in a flower bed in zone 2 or 3. I wouldn't put those pine needles in a flower bed right next to my house, but I would either put them in a flower bed or put them somewhere else. Some great trees that are more fire resistant: redbud, pecan, oak, ash, elm. I know like with ash especially, there's you either love it or you hate it. Sweet gum's another one of those, you either love it or you hate it. You know, with ash, and I know even to a certain extent with sweet gum, some of those faster growing trees, a lot of times are self-pruners, so you've got to be mindful of that as well. So with these bigger trees, especially, you know, if you know it's a self-pruner, ash, pecan even, plant it in zone 2, zone 3, so if that branch were to fall, it's not going to fall on your house for one thing, but then 2, you know, you can clean up and remove that fuel from the landscape. Make sure you maintain your vegetation, whether it be grasses, shrubs, or trees. Overgrown vegetation is a continuous source of fuel. So if you've got dead vegetation, clean it up. If you've got an overgrown tree, clean it up. You know, move that vegetation if you can. If you need to, move vegetation 3 foot away from the house just to provide you a little defensible space. Reduce, trim, or replace larger plants, and break up the plant continuity with non-combustible materials such as rock or even turf grass. So you know, by providing some of those barriers. If you've got porch or a patio, try and move those plants about 3 foot away, because that porch or patio, especially if it's made out of wood, that's a fuel source. Move them at least 3 foot away, and use low growing or moist plants if you're going to plant them around that patio or deck. We've talked about ladder fuels. They're present when fire can climb from the lower regions or the lower vegetation to higher vegetation. So remove those ladder fuels in that zone 1, in that 30-foot defensible space that's around your house. And then laddering is acceptable in isolated areas or pockets away from structures or taller fuels. So if you've got a large piece of property, you've probably got a lot of tall trees. I've got a lot of tall trees, but they're outside of the zone 3 on my property. I let them go. Yeah, I realize that that's a potential fire source, but I'm going to let them go and let nature take its course with those. I'm going to really focus on that zone 1, 2, and 3 around my house in helping to create a defensible space to minimize that fire damage. So I'm going to remove dead vegetation, pruning out those dead limbs, raking up and removing those leaves and pine needles from underneath vegetation. And I'm going to clear out some of the space around the crown of those trees, leaving those trees plenty enough room to have their space to grow and to have room between my trees. Pruning out that low overhanging branches, especially if it's near a roof. Get rid of it. Not only is it rubbing against your roof, creating some roof damage, but if that tree were to catch fire, wow, you've got a direct conduit to your house. Locating those bigger trees away from my house, and I'm going to trim those lower branches at least 6 to 10 foot off the ground. I'm going to mow or remove any dry or tall grass or dry plants that's present. And I'm going to do watering. I'm going to try and keep my lawn healthy and green. Now, I realize in the summertime, most summers, we've got to decide, how much do we want to spend monthly on a water bill. And if you're on a well, you're in a good shape because you can keep that vegetation, that grass around your house a little bit greener by mowing, by keeping it watered. But, by creating that green, lush environment, that grass around your house, you're helping to minimize fuel for fires. Now, I realize in the last hour we've talked a lot about different plants, what different things in order to have around your house, to not have around your house. So I got it done within an hour. So are there any questions I can try and answer? I will say, if you want a good list of plants to plant around your house to help minimize fire damage, or a list of plants to stay away from, some internet resources for you. First off, the Texas A&M Forest Service. While their website might not be the easiest thing to navigate, the Texas A&M Forest Service has some great resources on minimizing fire damage on your property, especially in regards to trees. So either do a Google search for Texas A&M Forest Service, or put Texas A&M Forest Service fire damage, and it'll come up with some of their resources. Another thing to look for, you can do a Google search for FIREWISE, 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 and that will take you and give you a long list of resources regarding plants to put in zone 1, zone 2, zone 3, plants to avoid, other building concepts to think about and keep in mind when building and designing property. So FIREWISE is another term to look for online. A lot of resources with that. Yes, ma'am. I know that and I mentioned some of those paints earlier. It does. Yeah, no, but I mean, great to bring that up again. There are those fire resistant or fire retardant type paints, and like Kim said, it does give you a 30-minute window where you can either that means that you've got an extra 30 minutes for the fire department to come and put it out, or maybe you can get it under control with a water hose. But yes, if you've got wood decks, if you've got a wood structure house, if the outside of your house is wood, maybe painting it with those fire retardant paints would certainly be a good step to take in minimizing that fire damage. Yes. Yes, there is clear. I remember I was first introduced to those paints, 30 some odd years ago, when living in the dorm there on the campus of A&M. We had a loft. The school provided us with bunk beds, but we were too cool. We had to build our own wooden structure so we could. enlarge the floor space of our little tiny house. And that was one of the requirements that if we were going to have a loft, it needed to be painted with those fire retardant or those fire resistant paints, because it did give you an extra 30 to 45 minutes before it would actually catch fire. And the same thing, with mulches. Use a decomposed granite, use rock, if you're just dead set on using a wood mulch, use a hardwood mulch like oak. Try and avoid pine bark mulch because of the oils in that pine bark. It'll burn really quickly.
I think it's a hardwood mulch that's been treated.
Okay. Yeah, but if you can find, if there is a treated hardwood mulch, go for that. Otherwise, if you can find just a hardwood mulch, utilize that. Yes, ma'am. So she was talking about the black hardwood mulch, about it possibly spontaneously combusting, not having it over 2.5 inches thick. And that's a good recommendation with all mulches, not having it more than 2 to 3 inches thick, because what does a mulch do? It helps to protect moisture that's in the soil. As it slowly decomposes, it provides nutrient to plants. But with black attracts that heat. So yes, you're gonna. It looks good, but there are some drawbacks to a black mulch. Now, I've not seen reports of it spontaneously combusting, but I'm not going to say it's not going to happen. It certainly could, especially if those temperatures get hot enough. So yeah, think about those mulches. Rock, decomposed granite, something besides wood is ideal, but if what you got is wood, go for those hardwood mulches, not a pine bark mulch. Anything else? All right, well, it's time to wake up then. We'll turn the lights on. Thank you for being here today. Hopefully you've learned a few things you can take home and help to put into practice, so that if we ever encounter a wildfire event in Leon County, I shouldn't say it's not if, it's when, that you can put a few steps in place to be prepared and to protect the investment that you've got in your own property.
Thank you, Richard.